Ryan here for Encore, Episode 4 of the Build Breakdown mini-series. This one is for the TRX4M muscle car I built in August 2024. It's a 2-speed setup, but not the same as this Beetle that I featured in Episode 1. They're both TRX4M, but other than the motor and steering servo, these builds don't share anything else in common. So let's take a look at 4 aspects to see how it's been built differently. Gearbox, chassis, bodyworks, wheels and tires, plus a couple of things that I plan to improve on this build. As usual, I've added chapters in this video for each part. The idea of building this rig started when I found this body on Etsy. My initial thought was that, if it's a muscle car, then it's got to have a high gear, right? But it can't be the Muse 2-speed gearbox again, because I used that on the Beetle. Then I discovered Oppai Factory's conversion kit that lets you use the FCX24 transmission on TRX4M, which I thought was a radical idea. I'm no stranger to FCX24 because I have a brushless powered power wagon and I love the gear ratios on this thing. It's got a big spur gear that delivers high torque and a very predictable slow crawl. On high gear, this thing does not only rip, it flies. But FCX24 uses portal axles and it's a key part of the design. So if you take that gearbox and pair it with straight TRX4M axles, then you have a completely different animal. And animal it is, because after crawling with this rig, I've concluded that the FCX24 transmission can turn a TRX4M into a beast. The Oppai Factory conversion kit includes the shifter servo, the servo link, and 2 servo mounts to choose from. So you can either use a stock FCX24 transmission and motor assembly, or you can use this aftermarket metal version that's more suitable for brushless motors. The kit comes with a pinion gear that you can use for the stock TRX4M motor, but you won't need it if you're gonna use a Furitech brushless kit since it comes with the pinion gear pre-installed. When buying the kit, you can choose from 3 base plate options. This one here is the high clearance variant. It comes with these attachments that lets you move the whole assembly up if you want the bottom part to be flushed with the chassis rails, which will give you more ground clearance. But I ended up not using these attachments to keep the center of gravity lower. If you want to build a long wheelbase TRX4M using all rear links, there's also a variant of this base plate that lets you do that. One thing I like about this base plate is that you can mount the transmission facing either way. You can rotate this whole assembly around if you want the motor to face forward, but I mounted my motor facing the rear because I have my scale driver here on the left. The next order of business is choosing the chassis. I tried 3 different options for this. I tried the Gila Monster chassis and the Muse LCG chassis, both of which are good options, but I ended up using this Injora carbon fiber LCG because it doesn't require sanding down or chopping down this servo mount here in order to fit. It also has a flat skid, which I think is more suitable than an angled skid for this build. I originally planned on making bumpers, but I ended up not making them because the approach angle was already low. But if I decide to make them in the future, I can just put these rail extensions for the bumper mounts and build the bumper from there. One downside of using this chassis for the FCX24 transmission is that you can't use a baseplate mounted battery tray or even a double-decker tray because one of the mounting holes happen to be right next to the shifter link. If you mount the gearbox facing the other way, it still won't work because of the servo. So my temporary solution for this was to strap a big battery to a cross member so I won't need a tray. So far, it hasn't slid out of place while crawling, but this is one of the things that I have yet to improve on this build. Also, This chassis does not come with any side tray or magnetic mount, so I just used the side trays that came with the Muse chassis and then modified it with styrene boards to fit some magnets. It's not perfect. It could be better, but it will do for now. This body from SkillSwitch is based on the AMC Javelin, a somewhat rare American muscle car in the 70s. It's not as popular as the Mustang or Camaro, and some would even consider it an oddball. Well, I thought it was pretty suitable for a post-apocalyptic style of build, so I went for it. If you search online, you'll see some resto mods of this vintage muscle car, but there are also a few actual 4x4 builds of the AMC Javelin. I find the resin blend on this 3D print kind of unique. Some parts are flexible and some parts are rigid where you need them. For example, this lower part of the side panel is flexible, and I think that helps with impact resistance when it tips over sideways. The front and rear ends are rigid, even the roof, pillars, and side mirrors. But you can somehow twist the body to a certain extent without breaking. I've crawled with this under the sun during its first outing, and so far, I haven't noticed any warping. But that's my experience, and it's not a guarantee. The first work I did with this body was for the tire clearance. I didn't want the tires to be oversized, but I had to trim the wheel wells to allow unobstructed steering, especially for high gear driving. The rear tires also have minimal rubbing when the shocks are fully compressed, so that has also been helpful on challenging climbs. This supercharger here is 3D printed from a file that I purchased from Etsy. I wanted the size to suit the scale, so I had it printed by a shop in 3 slightly different sizes to see which fits best before cutting up the hood. You'll notice that the supercharger has an asymmetrical design, but I carved out a symmetrical hole on this hood, so it will be easy to replace it with something else in the future. The supercharger is glued under the hood on this part and on this styrene board here behind the front grille, and that should make it easy to replace. Another thing I've done before the paint job is I scribed the panel lines on the doors and the hood because they're not very apparent. I had to make the panel lines thicker and deeper so they can remain obvious even after adding layers of primer and paint. For the paint job, first was dry sanding with Grit 600 to soften some imperfections. Then, I sprayed 3 thin layers of high-build 2K epoxy surfacer, followed by wet sanding using Grit 1000 to smoothen the primer surface before painting. My first layer of paint was medium gray with matte finish. Then I hand-painted some brown patches on the body and topped that layer with matte coat and then dried overnight. The next layer was matte anthracite or dark gray and aluminum. To reveal the rusty spots, I dry sanded some portions very lightly with 800 and 1000, and I was careful enough not to overdo it. Lastly, I finished the patina effect with hand-painted details and the final matte coating. I made this simple interior cage from styrene rods using hand tools. It's not very functional, and it provides very little support to strengthen the body. I only added it to complete the look. These light bar brackets are also handmade from styrene board because they had to be bent inwards and tucked into the window frame. The window frame is styrene as well, and this window screen is made from size 10 steel mesh and glued behind the frame. The interior panels are also styrene. You can see that it's still roughly done, and this can be improved. I want it to be detachable, like I did for my FJ45 and wheelies. So I punched 2 small holes here that line up with the cage to keep it in place without using adhesive. This large hole here is for the gearbox and motor, so the interior panel can sit low. My driver is 3.75 inches tall, which is the same size as the other drivers I used for my FJ45 and wheelies. My original plan was to use the LGRP Black Label tires I had for this build, but the 3D printed inserts shipped very late. So instead, I ordered these 55mm comp pins from Injora. I stuffed these with soft yellow silicone inserts and used them only for the front. At the rear, I used my old 56mm Injora tires and stuffed it with the stiffer green inserts. What I'm after here was I wanted to see if I can get more grip in front than the back and see if it helps in climbing. It's like creating an underdrive-like effect without changing the differentials. The rear tires are a little bigger, stiffer, and older than the front wheels, so in effect, the rear tires simply unload while waiting for the front tires to catch a hook instead of pushing the rig forward, which can make the car tip over backwards. Some of you may be opposed to this approach and would prefer using underdrive gears instead. But it's a known fact that underdrives are good for uphill traction but not for side hilling, and I don't want that because I like crawling on side slopes. There are a couple of things that I still need to work on for this build. First would be the side trays and magnetic mounts. I like how the side panels of the body are flexible, but it causes the magnets to slip. I can either put a latch or a bump here on the body to prevent the side trays from sliding down, or I can make the side panels stiffer and add more magnets. I also plan on replacing this battery with the smaller one and fabricating a small battery tray that I can bolt onto this part of the chassis, or it can bridge over the drive shaft from side tray to side tray. For the cage, since it's mostly aesthetic, I want to combine it with the interior and make it detachable from the body so I can reduce the top weight whenever I want to. I haven't filmed this rig on high speed, but I plan on doing so when I get a chance to visit the beach or some dunes. But before I do that, I need to make some fender liners to somehow shield the electronics and interior from sand. And lastly, to push the post-apocalyptic look further, I want to do a marauder mode on the body by adding weapons and body armor. I already have a machine gun with ammunition boxes from a donor toy. The bumper and armor I still have to make. I want everything to be detachable from the body, so that would be a fun project to do in the future. This car weighs 768 grams with the battery and interiors. It has a 53% front weight bias and 1% heavier on the left side. One might think that these numbers don't look very good, but numbers are numbers, and that's just on paper. What's important is how well it crawls on the trail. The combination of low CG and the gearing made this build a decent performer. Anyway, all these numbers can still be improved in different ways. So that's it for this build breakdown. I'll do 1 or 2 more episodes over the holidays. I wish each one of you more fun, more playing time, and of course, more builds. Thank you for watching and keep rocking!